public at large. So there's something about this process that itself feeds back into the institutions that then keep this process going. Also, in this process, as I've mentioned before, these boundary, if you will, gets navigated partly because of the agendas of different actors on both sides of the boundary, as well as the resources that actors can get. So let me give two examples of that. One recent agenda, starting with Bill Clinton, going through the recent George Bush and into the Obama administration, has been something called charitable choice, which is an attempt to try and get federal monies for federal priorities, such as marriage programs or food relief or homeless services, has tried to channel those monies not just into religious nonprofits, but into churches themselves. There's been some recent research done that shows in the initial push to have charitable choice laws finalized at the federal level, it was an attempt by political actors, especially the Bush administration, to try and basically kind of bring in black evangelical audiences into the Republican Party, because by making monies available to churches, which especially in black communities are incredibly important locales of social support, it was somewhat of a way, a political way, to kind of pull in religious group members into a certain political party. But on the other side, religious actors will also cross this boundary for resources. There's some classic cases coming from the 1960s and 1970s of Catholic schools becoming financially strapped, who basically file a number of cases saying, hey, if we teach non-religious classes, math, history, English, things like that, shouldn't we be able to get state support for that sort of activity? And there were some rulings that, there was actually a whole panoply of rulings, but some rulings that said, yes, you should be able to if you're doing the exact same things that are being done in state-funded classrooms. So we can see that actors from both of these institutions will cross sides in this process, and actually the fact that it's a non-settled process actually plays to their strength because they can get these resources. Another point about the fact that it's an unsettled process is that in and of itself will drive actors, especially religious actors, to get involved in trying to settle this process. So there's this kind of feedback loop. Because the process is unsettled, it'll push people to get involved to settle the process. These people's efforts at trying to settle the process will continue to keep the process unsettled. So this is a game, if you will, in a sociological sense that we expect to keep seeing played out. Now let me make just a few kind of closing comments about this metaphor. Now we talk about the separation of church and state. And as I've mentioned, nowhere in the document, in those First Amendment clause, does that word separation come up. And importantly, nowhere does the concept of the wall of separation come up. That's from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in the early 1800s to a friend, basically describing this process. What's important about a metaphor of the wall of separation is that defines, for many of us cognitively, what the relationship should be. So even in some of your all's writing, I saw this metaphor come out a lot. Well, isn't there a separation of church and state, or shouldn't there be a wall between the two? And what's really interesting is that that metaphor does not completely line up with this process that I've just described. So the metaphor of a wall is a metaphor that suggests staticness, okay? It suggests a set relationship. It suggests a line that doesn't blur the two institutions but completely separates them. And what's interesting is that for most of us, that is the understanding we have of church and state in the country. Though, as I've said before, institutionally and the way political processes work out, that's not how this plays out. What you end up with then is that the metaphor actually helps to drive some of that conflictual process, because we understand what we think the relationship should be. We see that it's not a clear wall of separation, and that in itself drives actors to get involved in this process of church and state relationships. So this is some pretty heady stuff, but what I want to say is that you guys have kind of been getting into the thick of it, and to understand church and state relationships requires something of us being able to step back, being able to interpret and see what the founders meant, but then being able to interpret to see what has happened since that time in U.S. history and in politics and in legal cases around these things. One other thing about the church-state reading we did, especially from Whitty, is many of you question what Whitty, this historian, was doing. And he was doing kind of classic history in the sense of looking at documents and looking at processes, looking at the time period, and trying to decipher what the potential meanings are of these church and state relationships. And many of you wonder, did he have kind of a purpose in what he was doing? And as I read Whitty, I think he did have a purpose. I think as a historian, he was saying we could better understand ourselves today if we understand what was written into these documents at the time. Though he did offer kind of a range of what he called thinner and thicker readings. The thicker readings, for the most part, I read him as kind of in the accommodationist camp of basically arguing that these founding documents provide room for the state to be involved in religious matters, maybe not to establish a church or to remove the free exercise of religion, but to be involved in kind of this gray area of all sorts of things that come up in terms of church and state relationships. So kudos to you that we're able to not only listen to Whitty's argument, but then also ask, how does Whitty, as a historian of these things, play into the very struggle that we've been talking about? So moving on to what we read, I need my eraser. Moving into what we read about the military arguments, what I want to do is not give so much give background about those arguments, but to reflect on the arguments that you all made about religion and the military. And basically, you all fell into two camps. Not surprisingly, they're the camps I talked about in the last lecture. The separationist camp, which concentrates on the no establishment clause. So in other words, the military shouldn't be doing this because doesn't this establish religion? And most of you fell into what we would call the accommodationist camp, which is more concern for the free exercise clause, so wanting to make sure that individuals who had joined the military can exercise their religious practice. Now, what was interesting in some of these discussions was there were also some of you who have experience with the military that fell on both sides of these camps. And I thought that added kind of an interesting dynamic to say, like, well, what does this stuff look like on the ground? One of you commented and said, well, you know what, there are services and there are chaplains for Jews and Muslims in the military, so maybe it's not as kind of Christian-centric as the article sounds. But then another of you said, well, you know, I've had experience practicing at a religious place on a military base, and you know what? What it seemed like was that the chaplain was really kind of using and molding religion towards the causes of the military. So already we have some kind of great kind of on-the-ground data about what these situations look like in practice, because that's part of the challenge, is to go from that metaphor that we talked about to the actual practice on the ground. And what's funny in all this is that I remember that I actually am the product of a military religious environment. I was actually baptized in a chapel on a military base, but as in all things in the military, nothing's permanent. So when I went back to find that chapel one time when I was in Virginia, it had been bulldozed over and had become a parking lot. So I don't know what that metaphor tells us or what that experience tells us, but what's interesting to me is that in my own biography, I'm kind of caught up in the middle at this at some level. So let me talk a little bit about these arguments. Those who I call the separationists in the group, they were worried that the military might be a coercive environment. Coercive in the terms that if religion is something that's supported by the military, then it's possible that it could work its way into trainings and hiring procedures and team building and stuff like that. And for those who are non-religious or aren't having their religion represented, it could feel coercive. There was also concern, and Sterling in particular mentioned this, that the government could corrupt religion. So in other words, by putting religion in the context of the military and hiring and firing chaplains, there could be a corruption of the religious message.